weapons industry said we require nuclear power as a sort of Trojan horse, camouflage to hide behind. And then everyone said it was safe. The Japanese didn't want nuclear power after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but they were talked into it.
Yet what could explain the inaction and willful ignorance of our entrusted authorities? The United Nations, the IAEA, the World Health Organization, the US government, NATO, and on and on. It is well known that the nuclear industry has long and very powerful tentacles that penetrate into and crisscross through governments, multinationals, and the defense industries. At Chernobyl, the Soviet regime wanted to hush the severity of the accident, as it would call into question the legitimacy and prestige of Soviet nuclear power. At Fukushima, we find that the Mark I nuclear reactors were designed by General Electric, who have 23 Mark I reactor plants operating across the United States, and in total has designed 91 nuclear power plants in 11 countries. Despite several engineers resigning decades ago over the design flaws of the Mark I reactor, its design was nevertheless approved for use. A Japanese media official, a week after the earthquake, speaking anonymously, stated, "The United States is trying hard to prevent Japan from exposing the role of General Electric Company by exerting too much pressure on Japan." The United States' effort is aimed at preventing further pessimism on behalf of the Japanese people towards the US. General Electric has very strong ties to the military-industrial complex and the US government, and incredibly does not pay taxes in the United States, despite multi-billion-dollar annual profits. The IAEA itself admits that it exists in order to promote nuclear power, no less. David Biello, the energy and climate editor at Scientific American Online, said that obtaining clear information on incidents such as the Fukushima Daiichi disaster is very difficult. Biello states that there is a lot of secrecy that can surround nuclear power because some of the same processes that can be involved in generating electricity can also be involved in developing a weapon. So there's a kind of veil of secrecy that gets dropped over this stuff that can also obscure the truth. The Nuclear Energy Institute, a policy organization for the nuclear industry with 350 companies, which of course includes TEPCO, has not responded to journalists' requests for information on funding research and chairs at universities. M.V. Ramana, a researcher at Princeton University specializing in the nuclear industry, reveals that most of the funding for nuclear research does not come directly from the nuclear lobby, but from governments who receive donations from the lobby. Ramana continues this by saying, "The Department of Energy has a very close relationship with the nuclear industry, and they sort of try to advance the industry's interest. So those people who get funding from that, it's not like they, the researchers, want to lie, but there's a certain amount of, shall we say, ideological commitment to nuclear power, as well as a certain amount of self-censorship. It comes down to wondering how their next application for funding might be viewed," he said. A Department of Energy program called Major Areas of Research concerns not only engineering, but also nuclear weapons. As a case in point, the genesis of plutonium and depleted uranium from power plant nuclear fission finds its way into weapon systems of the US military.
The utilities make money by selling electricity, that's all. They don't have to build the reactors, it's all subsidised and paid for. I mean, no other industry has that sort of subsidisation, and do you know why? Because it's the prodigal son of the weapons industry. And when nuclear power was begun by Eisenhower in the 50s, atoms for peace, the weapons industry said we require nuclear power as a sort of Trojan horse, camouflage to hide behind. And then and then everyone said it was safe. The Japanese didn't want nuclear power after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but they were talked into it. So it's a really wicked, wicked industry.
The use of depleted uranium munitions in Fallujah, Iraq, has resulted in contamination and poisoning of civilians and US soldiers. Horrifying birth defects among the offspring of Iraqis and returning US soldiers, and the lack of acknowledgement of this disaster, merely hint of a wider and sinister agenda by the US government and the nuclear industry. In Japan itself, an independent report revealed that the Fukushima meltdowns were preventable had the government and TEPCO followed basic safety recommendations. Instead of shoring up emergency power systems, TEPCO successfully fought off any regulations that would cost them money or expose the lack of safety controls at their plants to the public. The report also placed blame on the government for colluding with TEPCO by permitting internal complacency in lieu of official regulations stipulated on the books. Moreover, nuclear plants have been restarted despite hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens protesting against them. It seems that the government is the nuclear industry, and the nuclear industry is the government. Certainly, this very, very cozy relationship between TEPCO, GE, the United States and Japanese governments, the military-industrial complex, and even international nuclear research academia, plus the intertwining of nuclear engineering and nuclear weapons interests, goes a long way to explaining why any negative news about the reactors and their radiation is strongly suppressed and ridiculed. Instead of focusing on the perils of radiation and taking preventive action, the powers that be seem hell-bent on provoking new disasters. The drums of war and nuclear confrontation in the Middle East are being pounded at this moment. Another towering spectre of radiation has raised its head, that of nuclear war. The United States and NATO are moving inexorably to force regime change in Syria and Iran, partially to protect Israel, a known nuclear weapons power, and the only one in the Middle East. Russia has stipulated that it will intervene if Syria and Iran are attacked by NATO. In the lead-up to the November 2012 elections, the temptation for Barack Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, to wage open war, deploying US troops on a vilified foreign enemy, and have the US public rally around the commander-in-chief, may prove too much. The problem is that it just may trigger a hot and nuclear war in the Middle East and escalate globally. If we are to confront this crisis, we will have to deal not only with the ongoing radiation release, but three major shadow points that threaten to escalate the crisis to a possible extinction-level event. Firstly, the three reactor cores from Fukushima Daiichi reactor buildings 1, 2 and 3. After much denial and distortion, it has emerged that all three have been melting through the soil and ground beneath the building since March 12, 2011. This is what is dubbed China syndrome, where a super hot, melted down reactor core penetrates the floor of its building and bores and burns its way into the ground below, all the way to China metaphorically, contaminating the soil and water table. If a reactor core finds water beneath, it can easily react with it and cause a steam-powered hydrovolcanic explosion. Next, there is the matter of the plutonium-laden seawater that has been repatriated back into the Pacific Ocean. It has been projected that it will take 5 years for the radioactive plutonium seawater to encompass the whole of the Pacific Ocean. There is little indication that the plutonium release into the ocean has been halted to this day. Bluefin tuna have already shown up on the California coast with radioactive cesium in their bodies. The seafood basket of the world, the Pacific Ocean, along with its ecosystems and biodiversity, is imperiled beyond all measure. The consumption of any Pacific seafood must be vigorously discouraged, yet little has been done to prohibit it. Even green groups have been relatively silent on this issue for reasons unknown.
The New York Times is reporting that 200 tons of radioactive liquid are being poured into the nuclear reactors and the fuel pool at Fukushima every day. Well, where's it going? If it's going in, it's coming out. And it's coming out two ways. It's coming out as radioactive steam, and it's coming out as radioactive water. Offshore radioactive readings in the ocean have gone up, and they're now over 3,000 times higher than the standards that are routinely expected. That's not coming from the air. The ocean's too big to be polluted by what's coming out of the airborne releases. It's clearly leaking from the trenches into the ocean. They haven't found the leak, but the only source of quantities of radioactive material large enough to pollute the ocean has got to be leakage from these trenches.
Finally, the last escalator is reactor number 4 at the very heart of the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Reactor 4 itself was empty, but it housed a very large and uncontained spent nuclear fuel pool on its roof. Due to the explosion, the Reactor 4 building is severely damaged and has 1,535 fuel rod assemblies that are immersed in water but exposed to the air and the elements. They are also stacked high in the air on elevated racks like mere warehouse inventory. Moving these rods must be done while immersed in water and in heavily protected structures in an environment that is now highly radioactive. The crane equipment designated to perform this task was destroyed in the tsunami. Work has only just started now, in late 2012, on reinforcing Reactor Building 4 with a view to removing the 1,535 fuel assemblies. The projected time that it will take to secure and remove the fuel assemblies is 2.5 to 3 years, so sometime in 2015 or 2016. Another 7 or 8 magnitude earthquake is all that it would take to collapse the building and allow the fuel rods to crash to the ground, exposing them to the air and sparking the burning of all that cesium into the atmosphere. Such a fire cannot be put out with water once it is ignited. Contact with water creates a pyrophoric reaction in which oxygen from the water itself is extracted by the super hot rods to continue and enhance the burning and thus affect the release of radiation and cesium. Even a rocket-propelled grenade attack by North Korean frogmen would do in Reactor 4. The collapse of this single building would be so catastrophic since the subsequent release of the 1,535 fuel assemblies would easily trigger a huge radiological fire that would quickly spread to a nearby common spent fuel pool a mere 50 meters away, with a further 6,375 fuel assemblies. This represents about 50 times the amount of radioactive cesium released from Chernobyl. There are a further 3,511 spent fuel assemblies in the Daiichi plant, and if they were absorbed into the fire also, it would be a cesium release 85 times that of Chernobyl. Mitsuhei Murata, a respected diplomat and former Japanese ambassador to Sweden, declared that if Reactor 4 collapses, the whole of the Earth's northern hemisphere would have to be evacuated, and does not rule out a global human extinction event. Nuclear scientist Arne Gundersen and physician Helen Caldecott have both stated that they would leave the northern hemisphere if Reactor 4 collapsed.
If there's another earthquake and Building 4 collapses, which contains the cooling pool with fresh fuel, I'm going to evacuate my family from Boston.
If the spent fuel pool at Reactor 4 hits the ground, that is literally the end of Tokyo, Yokohama, and most of Honshu. There's no question about it. It has visually been observed to be leaning in the past month
that the rest of the world is doing nothing to help the Japanese because it's going to poison us in North America, Europe, all the way around the world.
Every damn scientist, the best of the best from Europe, Russia, China, America, should be in Japan or studying this around the clock and making recommendations. They got to get not only outside the box, they got to get outside the planet to start thinking about this, or there isn't going to be any planet left. It's that bad.
Right.
The tonnage just in spent fuel pool number 4 is over 260 tons of rods, fuel rods. And remember, they were new ones. Most of them were used. This is what we're told anyway. There were MOX fuel rods in there, and when a fuel rod has lived its useful life, boiling water, it's far more dangerous than it was as a brand new fuel rod that first gets inserted into the reactor vessel. It's all nuts.
It is indeed very possible that the radioactive scourge could engulf the entire planet and spark a major die-off of the human species and the animal and plant life we live alongside and depend upon. The characters in On the Beach knew they were doomed from the outset. Yet more than a gloomy surrender film, On the Beach was ironically a plea to its audience. The banner declaring there is still time was perhaps a desperate cry from the year 1959 to the future to highlight the potential dangers and horrors of nuclear power and radiation in order to galvanize its audiences to make better choices, take action, and demand answers to bring about happier tomorrows. The inexplicable absence of any credible government or multilateral response, or even reasonable coverage from mass media outlets, suggests that these institutions are captured by the international nuclear industry. It seems we the people are alone on this one. There is still time, not to savor before we die, but to speak out and act in order that we and our brethren do not die out. If we act, we may be able to salvage something of our environment and protect our children. If inaction and indifference is to be our response, then we are, for all intents and purposes, no matter where we live across the globe, all standing on Fukushima beach together, waiting for the lethal radiation to take us en masse. We will be judged by our children, one way or another.